Okay, I think we can get started, Sarah Linda.
Yeah, I think I just let in the last person I saw in the waiting room, but we can keep letting people in as they arrive. So again, welcome. Thank you so much for sharing this beautiful fall Sunday afternoon with us to come and hear Dr. Katherine Manthorne speaking about Eliza Pratt Greatorex. So Dr. Manthorne is the author of Restless Enterprise, The Life and Art of Eliza Pratt Greatorex, as she traces the travel of a woman who was considered to be among the greatest American women in history, not just the greatest American female artist, but one of the greatest American women in history, but she has long been forgotten. She was once described as the first artist of her sex. The enterprising Greatorex emigrated from Ireland, became a leader in the American women's movement of the 19th century, and went on to document her time in New York, Munich, Paris, Great Britain, Ireland, Morocco, Colorado, and France through her landscape paintings, drawings, and prints. And one of the most wonderful things about this artist and about the work that Dr. Manthorne has done on her is that in a way she crystallizes the two exhibitions that we have here at the Hudson River Museum right now, landscape art and virtual travel with notable loans from Art Bridges, the Art Bridges Foundation, and also Women to the Fore, which is an exhibition that consists of more than 40 female identifying artists in honor of the Year of the Woman. And these works are both from our collections and on loan from the artists and other generous lenders, as well as a site-specific mural that was created by 3 Yonkers-based women artists, especially for the exhibition. So if you have not already been able to visit the museum to see these exhibitions or check them out on the website, I very much invite you to do so. And you can see how this talk really integrates the themes that we're looking at this fall. A little bit about Dr. Manthorne. She is a specialist in modern art of the Americas. She earned her PhD from Columbia University. Prior to joining the graduate faculty at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, she was director of the Research Center at the Smithsonian's American Art Museum. Her scholarship had long focused on landscape and hemispheric dimensions of American art, beginning with Tropical Renaissance, North American artists exploring Latin America, 1839 to 79, and continuing in California Mexicana, missions to murals, 1820 to 1930. Eager to better highlight the role of women within the visual culture of the Americas, her book, Film and Modern American Art, The Dialogue Between Cinema and Painting, included a chapter on women of the silent era. 2 new books continue that focus: Women in the Dark, American Female Photographers, 1850 to 1900, and what we are going to be looking at today, Restless Enterprise, The Art and Life of Eliza Pratt Greatorex. Dr. Manthorne lives in New York City with her husband, James Lancel McElhenney, and their cat, Maeve. So one note before I introduce Dr. Manthorne, thank you all for being here. You will note that you are muted, and we ask that you turn your video off during the talk just to minimize distraction. And if you have any questions or comments, please put them in the chat box, and we will address them at the conclusion of the talk. So if there are no further questions, Dr. Manthorne, please, thank you so much for coming and sharing your time and expertise with us today.
Hello, everyone. I'd like to thank you all for joining us. I'd like to thank Sarah Linda Lichtblau for inviting me to speak, Olivia Cipriano for help on Zoom, and Laura Vogels and the staff at the museum for organizing these 2 exhibitions that Sarah Linda was mentioning, Women to the Fore and the virtual travel, in fact, do provide the perfect link for my talk today. And as you see on my title page, Eliza Pratt, she was born Eliza Pratt in 1819, and here on the left, I'm just showing you a map of Ireland. She comes from Leitrim and then moves to New York in 1848 during the potato famine. Within a year, marries the composer and musician from Britain, Henry Greatorex, and thus after that, she goes by the name Eliza Greatorex, and her Irish identity is basically concealed. But here you can see this is she's the subject of my new book, as Sarah Linda was mentioning, that's out at the beginning of December. The title Restless Enterprise, as you'll discover, beautifully characterizes the constant travels and strivings of this remarkable woman. And as long as I'm expressing thanks, I should say that I'm especially grateful. The book is coming out from the University of California Press, and the fact that they faced all the challenges of the pandemic and still got the book out is amazing, and I'm so grateful for that. So this afternoon, I want to avoid sort of one of those talks that you go from the cradle to the grave, and instead just talk about a few major issues. So I'll start out with a question to you. Can you name one female artist active in the United States in the 1850s and 60s, other, of course, than Greatorex that we've given you this little hint about? So take a minute to think about this. This is the era of the Hudson River School, more or less.
Julie Hart Beers.
Good, okay. And of course, Lily Martin Spencer. So here's two works that you can see here on the screen. Spencer was known in these days for her still lifes, such as this work on the left, which is in the exhibition. And she also painted images of children and domestic scenes, such as the one on the right. And here you can see she's lifting up her spoon, "Kiss me and you'll kiss the lasses." So she's kind of teasing us because she's referring to the molasses in her spoon. And of course, if you give her a kiss, then you're going to get a little sticky. So she talks about the fact that these pictures were popular, but that she didn't really make very much money off of them. And as a woman with 13 children and a husband who was basically working as her agent, financial issues, of course, were challenging. So this just gives you one idea of how difficult it is for a woman at that time to forge a career in the arts. So in the next half hour or so, I aim to introduce you to this ambitious and talented Greatorex, whose career was on the rise in the 1860s as Spencer was waning. So let's just begin with this portrait by Boyle, Ferdinand Boyle, in 1869. In that year, her male colleagues elected her to become a member of the most prestigious art organization in the country, the National Academy of Design. At that moment, she was the only female member. Spencer had been earlier elected as an honorary member, but they never really gave her full membership. So Greatorex's election was a great honor, especially at the time, because at the time, this Irish-born artist had been a widow for 10 years, and a single mother of limited financial means who was supporting her 4 children by the earnings of her art. So with election to the Academy, the requirement was that you had to provide a portrait of yourself. So she engaged Boyle to do this portrait of her. But let's stop a minute and ask about the title of the lecture. What does it mean to be a feminist artist in the 1860s? Reminding ourselves, of course, that the feminist movement really got going in the 1960s. So let's think about that as we go forward. Ferdinand Boyle painted the picture, but we can be sure that Eliza got her 2 cents in terms of what she wears, her pose, and the objects that she holds. And here I'm just showing you, immediately we look at her face framed by her gray hair arranged in loose curls, and note that this is not the usual likeness of the artist, who usually shows themselves more youthful, just starting out. And I'm just comparing her here to the self-portrait on the left by Lily Martin Spencer, done a bit earlier, and on the right by Mary Cassatt. So you can almost imagine this is the spectrum of the female talent from Spencer to Greatorex, and then later Cassatt basically eclipses Greatorex. So she's dressed in this loose black dress with a white lace collar, respectable, sensible, and even you might say somber. But as you look more closely, you can see that her left arm is resting on this portfolio. And I'm just showing you a close up on the left over here to see this book and the fact that she's holding this quill pen. So many artists show themselves with palette and paintbrush, of course. So the fact that she's holding the pen is significant. She had started out painting in the Hudson River School mode, so painting with oil paints on canvas, but she then gives that up to produce these pen and ink drawings of New York architecture. So what was happening was that these buildings were being just knocked down, and the whole city was undergoing urban renewal after the Civil War. So she is creating these drawings, and so you can almost imagine this portfolio here stuffed with works like this one. And here, you can just see this gives you a little bit of an idea of what was going on at the time. This is an image from Harper's Weekly. You can see in the distance, this building is inscribed 1776. It's being torn down. You can see the men working here. Other buildings are being surrounded in scaffolding. They're going to be next. But yet no one seems to mind about this. They're not worried about the fact that this colonial building is being torn down. The only person who seems the least bit concerned is this elderly gentleman here pointing over to this building. And so you can kind of imagine that this was Greatorex's attitude. The outrage that history is being lost, that these buildings are being torn down just to build, stores and apartment buildings and other things. So this was the state of affairs in this period when she started this project. And I just show you this one more image more closely. And what she did was she would accompany these images with text in the book that she eventually compiled. And as her text explained, built in 1767, this particular church destroyed in 1875. So this alone was sort of the outrage of the urban renewal at that moment in New York. So she also created this image. At the time, it was the whole home of Archibald Gracie, later became the home of the mayor of New York City. And this is actually one of the few buildings still standing. Greatorex drew maybe between 80 and 100 different buildings. And this is one of the very few that are still surviving. And here I'm just showing you, this is the kind of research that one does when they're tracking down these forgotten women. Literally, I followed her all around New York City to all the different sites she painted, to every place on the globe. And here I am with my assistant, husband, James McElhenney, and we are conferring with the former New York City Mayor Bloomberg about Gracie Mansion. So this is the kind of work you get to do when you work on forgotten women. So what I'd like to do and for the rest of the talk is really think about this idea of what are the different defining characteristics of a feminist, or we might say proto-feminist artist in this period. So I'm basically isolated 3 characteristics. First, defying convention and pursuing subjects generally defined as male. Number 2, women built all female networks to facilitate their art making. And number 3, they reject the idea that oil painting is the highest form of art. They use a variety of media. They're much more open. And they even worked in what were called, until very recently, the minor arts: printmaking, drawing, decorative arts. And they also work collectively. So these are the themes that I want to explore. So we'll look at some of Eliza's production as she painted the landscape first in upstate New York and then on her global travels. So soon after Greatorex emigrated from Ireland to New York, as I was saying before, she paints the Hudson River style. That doesn't sound so radical in itself, but if women were painters, it was generally accepted that they would do still lives of flowers or fruit or perhaps birds, or else children, the kinds of things that they could do in the home, because this was considered, more their domain. The accepted wisdom was that wild nature landscape was the domain that was better left to the men. But here you can see Eliza, her friend Fidelia Bridges on the left, her other friend, Julia Hart Beers, whom Paul Warman mentioned at the beginning. They dressed for the field and they went out into the open air. And here, I love this. This is a CDV, a small sort of visiting card of Fidelia Bridges, because you can see that she's standing in front of a backdrop that looks like landscape. And she must have had the suit custom made, because women normally had dresses that went all the way to the floor, dragging along in the streets that were so dirty at the time. Here you can see she's had it made shorter so it doesn't catch on the brambles and things. She has a hat that's going to stay on her head in the wind. So she's ready to go outside. She's also holding this her box here that has her easel and her umbrella. And this would be, she would go out into the field and set up, just like the painting by Winslow Homer. So I wanted to show you this picture, because you can see, first of all, that these men are not the tiniest bit original. They're all seated cheek to jowl, looking at the same white mountain motif, and they're all painting together. But yet, and of course, we have to notice that they're all men. So we just wonder what would happen if Fidelia or Eliza Greatorex or some of the other women showed up and set up their easels next to them. We can only imagine that they would have been a bit surprised. So I just want to show you a couple of samples of the kind of work Greatorex did in the Hudson Valley. And we have to realize too that Greatorex has been married and widowed, that she gave back birth to 3 of her own children and took care of the stepson of her husband's previous marriages as well. So in order to pursue her career, she has to make some decisions that were very difficult in her day. She recognized, prior to painting this painting, she recognized that her landscape skills were not as good as she wanted them to be. So she wanted to go to France to study at Barbizon. So she left her children in the care of other people, and she went to Europe to study in 1861. Now, if you think of that year, 1861, what was going on? Civil War broke out in the United States in April of that year, right? So she still stays in Europe for almost an entire year, leaving her children in the care of her sister while she pursues her studies. So these are the kinds of, she's rejecting society's idea of the cult of domesticity that dictated that she should be a stay-at-home mother. And she's finding ways to pursue her career in other kinds of avenues. Oops, just lost me. And here's just another one of her works where you can see she's adding the architecture, the buildings in northern Manhattan. So the very act of painting as a professional then is a kind of defiant act, because at the time it was either thought that you picked matrimony and maternity, or you picked artistic production and a profession. And according to society, you couldn't do both. But that's what I find so amazing about her, and kind of captivated by her persona, that in the Civil War era, she was a wife, a mother, a world traveler, and a successful artist. She really kind of did it all. So I don't know how many people actually still read Jules Verne anymore, Around the World in 80 Days. But I just wanted to mention that as Greatorex is starting her, serious life of travel as an artist, this book came out in 1873, and of course it told the story of a fictitious character, Phineas Fogg, who made a bet that he could circumnavigate the globe in 80 days. And here you can see this is the route he took: Hong Kong, Calcutta. He goes through Africa at the Suez Canal. Now, if he had made this bet even 5 years before, he never would have been able to collect his money ever, because at that time he would have had to go all the way around Africa. And now he can go through the Suez Canal, which was constructed in 1869. Then he toodles along across Europe, across the Atlantic. And then when he gets to the United States, he's able to take the Transcontinental Railroad across the country in several days, instead of, again, taking months and months to either go around South America or something else. So these are the kind of options that Greatorex had as well. And I just wanted to show you too, that by 1890, a woman named Nellie Bly, who was a journalist, she actually made the journey, not like the novel, but she actually does it in 72 days. And here you can see that in this case, she's actually had the suit made, and this is her traveling bag. That's the only thing she carried with her. And so I think that she's really a model to all of us when we could resume travel again to dressed like that. So anyway, Greatorex packs up her family then, and she just decides to live in Bavaria for 3 years. She wants to learn architectural drawing and to reproduce her books. So they had their itinerary all planned. And for a while, she left her children. Again, her sister came with her for a while, and her children stayed with her sister. And Greatorex then, Eliza Greatorex goes to Oberammergau, and then she writes back to her children. Dear children, we must give up all our ideas of going on a projected summer sojourn to Berchtesgaden, and you must come to Oberammergau to me at once. I cannot write about what I have seen and felt today, but I have decided to live among these people this summer and see how their daily life accords with the marvelous religious service. So by the marvelous religious service, she's referring to the Passion plays that were postponed that summer because of the Franco-Prussian War. They occur, as I'm sure a lot of you know, once every year, 1850, 1860, 1870, but because of the Franco-Prussian War, they were actually postponed. And in fact, even this year, they were supposed to have been performed in 2020, but they've been postponed to 2022. So the towns, here you see, this is one of her images. They're arriving in the town by carriage. And I'm just comparing it to one of my own photographs. Here you can see this is the characteristic architecture of the region with this little onion top, and then this cryptful, this is the peak that is surmounts the town, and it sort of gives us the genius locus that in each picture you can she identifies the place as being over Ammergau with that particular peak. So in that time, the townspeople would rent out their houses. This is how they made some extra money. But then they were also the ones, again, as you probably know, they don't hire professional actors to do this play. All the people in the town perform the different roles. So, and the roles are get handed down within the family. So here you can see the Greatorex family stayed with the Sphinx. They were the characters Matthew and John. And then I'm just showing you, again, a photograph of the town because it's very curious. If any of you have ever been there, one of the special features of the architecture there is this, what's called the Luftmalerei in German, the outdoor frescoes that cover all the buildings. And they were there when Greatorex was there, but she doesn't include them. So I don't know if it's because of the subject matter or you know, that or what, but she does not include them. So anyway, she's spends the whole summer there. She draws the different houses, but never the theater, never the production of the play, and then writes a book about this. So her work is very well received there. And I just wanted to read you this one quote. In an interview with Piloty, who is the head of the New School of Painting in Munich, he named Mrs. Greatorex gravely and without any thought of flattery, one of the three women of the present day possessing the most original genius in drawing. So he includes Rosa Bonheur, who is a French woman who was very popular at the time, Eliza Greatorex, and the brilliant and successful English figure painter, Emily Osborne. So this is the company in which she's regarded. So while they're in Germany, the family is already plotting their next trip, which was to Colorado. So they take Eliza Greatorex and her two daughters, Eleanor and Kathleen, take the Transcontinental Railroad, which had only been running for a couple of years, out to Colorado, and then take a carriage and horseback to get to the area around Colorado Springs. So here I'm just showing you, again, on the right, this is one of the motifs of the Garden of the Gods. If you've been to that area, this is one of the tourist attractions then as now. And here you can see she's created this image to convey the look of some of these anthropomorphic stone creations, stone structures. And again, I just wanted to mention, you know, the idea of working on these artists. I tried to go to all the places that she went to. Here I am in the Garden of the Gods. And, you know, just to see what does this place really look like versus what she, how she showed them, and to get a little bit of a sense of just what, of course, things have changed dramatically in many ways, but you still get some kind of sense of what she was up to. So after Colorado, she does the New York project. We'll come back to that. But I wanted to mention that she then starts thinking, okay, well, I'm doing my pen and ink drawings. I'm turning over these drawings to be reproduced in these books by other people. I think I should learn to etch myself. So she decides to go to France and learn to etch, and which she does. So she works on plein air etchings. And here you can see these are just one example here from France. And what she would do is work on very small plates. They might be like 4 by 5 or 4 by 6 inches, copper plates that she would sit outside and work on in the open air, almost like as if they were a sketchbook. And here you can see Florence. And then, of course, Rome, which attracted many, many visitors. So these are the kinds of places, Paris, Rome, Florence, that by the 1880s were, tourist attractions. It wasn't so bizarre for women to go there, but it was unusual for women to head out to the American West by themselves, to take the Transcontinental Railroad by themselves. And then another thing that they did is they headed off to Morocco. So they decide to spend a year in Morocco. And this is a work that her daughter Eleanor created. So they're constantly challenging themselves, finding new subjects, motifs, living in new environments that inspired them. And they don't just hang out with other, Americans the way people would do it sometimes in France or in Rome or something. There were American colonies of artists. They would, in Morocco, they mentioned that, I found descriptions where they were living. They're living outside of the main settlement. And they even mentioned very casually that someone was murdered in the house where they lived prior to their arrival. But they said, oh, but we didn't really have any problem. So they're really quite the adventurous characters. So the next point I wanted to talk about is just this idea of that Greatorex would basically not have been able to accomplish the things she had if it weren't for the fact that she had this whole network that supported her in terms of, helping her with daily tasks, like her sister took care of the children or her daughters helped her in the studio, but also many friends gave her a lot of moral support. So this is another important aspect of all of this. So the other point to keep in mind is just like what's going on with women at this time. How is she able to negotiate these different activities that she's doing? What is the state of the women's movement? So since we are in this election year, I thought it would be fun just to mention that Victoria Woodhull was actually the first woman to run for president in 1872. And here you can see her on the right. This is a photograph of her. But then one of the many ways that the women were, society tried to sort of contain these women and critique them was with these rather cruel caricatures that appeared in the press. So here you can see, for example, this is Thomas Nast caricaturing Victoria Woodhull, and she ran on the free love ticket. So naturally, that was something that Nast wasn't going to let slip. He made fun of that. And here you can see, if you look in the background, this is one of the women that she might have been appealing to. Here you can see this, this poor woman is trudging up this hard hill with her idiot husband on her back, swilling down liquor, and her 2 children clinging to her. But even in the face of this, all of this, the caption reads, which I guess you probably can't see it all, but the wife says, "I'd rather travel the hardest path of matrimony than follow the path of free love." So this is just one example of what women are up to at the time. And this is another, Susan B. Anthony, who was actually a friend of Greatorex. In that same year, 72, she tested the political waters by marching into the voter registration office in Rochester, New York, and demanding that she be allowed to vote. She eventually persuaded the attendants there to accept her registration. In November 5th, she and 14 other women cast their ballots in the presidential race, which at the time was between Ulysses S. Grant and Horace Greeley, freely aware that they were actually creating or enacting something that was illegal. The pioneering suffragist was later singled out. The other 14 women never had any problem, but she was arrested and charged with voting unlawfully. Her trial took place the following June. She was never allowed to speak in her own defense, and she was fined $100, which she refused to pay. And so she was put in jail for a while. So, and again, you can see the kind of cruel caricature, sort of mannish woman. So Greatorex is friends with Susan B. Anthony. We know that I found a reference, she was at her 50th birthday party. She gave her one of her drawings. When Susan B. Anthony speaks in New York or in other places, oftentimes Greatorex is on the stage, partly because, other successful women are examples of what women can achieve if they're allowed to have economic independence. So all this is going on while Greatorex is forging her career. Another part of Greatorex's network is this woman. Again, I don't know how many people have ever heard of her, Elizabeth Elliott. She was the first person to write a history of women artists. It was called Women Artists in All Ages and Countries in 1859. And she actually included a very positive description of Greatorex. And finally, this is probably Greatorex's best friend, Mary Louise Booth, became the editor of Harper's Bazaar. And Mr. Harper, of course, had a giant publishing network. He had Harper's Weekly, he had Harper's Monthly, but then he had the idea, oh, more and more women are reading magazines. Let's have a women's magazine, and we'll get Mary Louise Booth to be the editor. She can show fashion and, lifestyle. But what Mary Louise Booth subtly did was she started including more and more serious content. She talks about women's rights. She talks about, anti-corsets. That was another big issue. And so she slowly, she gradually turns her magazine into something very different. But the other reason why I mentioned Mary Louise Booth is, again, imagine you're a woman in 1870 trying to advance your career as an artist. Where do you go to meet patrons? Who's going to buy your work? Where do you show your work? There are very few places. The women were barred from all the clubs. So, say Frederick Church or Winslow Homer, they could go to the Century Club or they could go to the Union League Club and meet businessmen who would buy their work, but the women were not even allowed to enter the door. So someone like Mary Louise Booth holds weekly salons. She knows everybody who's anybody. And so they come to the salons, and people like Greatorex made quite a few important contacts there. So this was another way that the women supported one another. And finally, of course, Greatorex is really, the family network is the most important thing. So here you can see is her daughter, Kathleen. She was considered the family beauty. Here's Eleanor, the younger daughter, who is considered more like the dependable daughter. And you can see also that her sister, whom I've mentioned before, her name is Matilda Pratt Despard, wrote the text to Greatorex's book. So all these different family connections and friendship connections are really what helps support her career. So finally, I just want to talk about the part 3, the women in the workplace, how they experimented with multiple media and their collaborative approach. I don't know if many of you know this painting. It's kind of, I think, a wonderful picture that says a lot. Emily Osborne, who was mentioned earlier, is one of the 3 great artists women artists of the time. She's working in Britain, and this is one of these wonderful Victorian story pictures. So you can see this young woman here has come into the shop with her painting to show to the proprietor, who doesn't seem to be all that interested. He doesn't even offer her a seat. He just leaves her standing there, right? These other men are sort of looking over, kind of curious, but no one's really giving her much help. So it suggests this idea that the women really have to struggle in the marketplace to get their work out there and to make a living. So what Greatorex starts to do is she moves away from oil painting. That's, think about it, a single painting, one person buys it, and that's kind of the end of it. She starts recording her different observations in the pen and inks, and then creates these books that reproduce her drawings. So here you can see this is the book from her travels in Colorado. And again, this is one of the images from the book. But just imagine these Victorian women, sort of hiking up her skirt. She talks about the fact that she had to tie her skirt up with her belt and stick her sketching umbrella in the belt as she climbed up the mountain. They're also getting suntanned. I mean, that was a big no-no in the Victorian era. You're supposed to have pale skin. So they're really kind of, taking on the adventures of Colorado before it was really settled, and writing this book about her experiences. So this is, again, another, the fact that she's traveling and doing this is one part of it, but making books is another, because I just wanted to show you, this is a wonderful painting by this French artist called Forbidden Fruit. But it tells us, again, that books and education were thought dangerous to young women. So if a woman artist is making images for book illustration, that was also, considered a tiny bit subversive. And this was a very popular painting. It was reproduced in all the American magazines. And you can see these 2 young women here looking at the book together. Another young woman is, quickly trying to find another good book to read, while their companion is listening with her ear to the door to make sure their guardian doesn't come along and catch them doing what is this very naughty thing, right? So it just gives you, kind of crystallizes this idea about books and women, and that these things are still in the wind. And the fact that Greatorex not only makes these small travel books, but here you can see this is her summation of all her New York work. And as you can see, I'm just giving you an idea of how large it is, 14 by 11 by 2 inches thick. And this is the title page, Old New York, From the Battery to Bloomingdale by Eliza Greatorex. But all these different motifs, these images here, were actually done by her daughter. So the daughters are collaborating with her. They're helping her to create these things and to get them out, and while her sister wrote the text. So it's really kind of like almost the medieval workshop, everybody working together. It carries the name Eliza Greatorex, but it's very much a collective effort. And here you can just imagine yourself turning the pages with these descriptive texts. And these are some of the buildings that, as I was mentioning earlier, that were being destroyed and that she's trying to capture for posterity. And this is just one example that I think is especially outrageous, so I thought I would show it to you. This is Union Square in 1849 looking south. So this is going down towards the Battery. And here you can see this one church here. This is a church by Renwick called the Church of the Puritans. So it was just recently built in the 1840s. It was quite a handsome church. Well, by the 1860s, Tiffany and Company decided that, they had been further downtown. It was getting crowded. They wanted a new shop. This was a nice area with this beautiful park. So they decided to knock the church down and build a new establishment for Tiffany's. So again, this was something you can imagine Greatorex, like getting news of these different buildings being knocked down and rushing to the site to capture them. And so this is what she did. This is the Church of the Puritans, and you can see the ladder here, and they're beginning to dismantle the whole thing. But not only was it an architectural landmark, this was a historic place. It was the site of the Equal Rights Association conference in 1867. And I'm just showing you a few of the, many distinguished people who were there. This is Elizabeth Cady Stanton. This is Lucretia Mott, another very well-known person, and Sojourner Truth, the former slave who fought both for the rights of African Americans and for women. So boom, this building is just knocked down. And so these are the kinds of things that Greatorex is trying to make people aware of. And we saw this before, but this is her North Dutch church that she drew. But this was a special place, and that she also made this incredible painting. I think this is fascinating because, again, this speaks to the idea that these women are very creative in the kinds of materials that they're using. They're using non-traditional materials. So she actually took a panel from the pulpit of the church as it was being dismantled. She paints the likeness of the church here. And then you have these two areas of inscriptions that her daughter did this kind of fancy script. So here, I'll just show you what it says. She says the cornerstone was laid in 1767, and it's demolished in 1875. So again, she just leaves these few facts to sort of sink into the reader of her books, and to realize how outrageous this really is, that the history is not being preserved at all. So I just wanted to conclude then with a few points about her legacy. So first, we didn't really mention this in this time period, but she was one of the people who actually spearheaded all the women to exhibit at the Centennial in Philadelphia in 1876. It was very late in the game that they actually even built a women's pavilion. And then a lot of the women artists weren't sending their works. So I found these ads in the New York Times and the New York Herald. It would say, go to Mrs. Greatorex's house. All women artists of New York were having a meeting to mobilize and to organize an exhibition for this important event. So here you can see, again, this is just a cartoon or an image from the newspaper, an illustration. And here they actually say Mrs. Greatorex's pen and ink drawings. Here they are. I mean, it was very rare that any of the works in the whole fair were, when they showed these different illustrations, were even identified. So she's being watched. People notice what she does. She was also Greatorex was also an important teacher, not only of her daughters, but also their generation. She taught classes, as artists do now, to make extra money. She taught classes for probably 30 years. And we saw this work on the left before by Eleanor, but these are two large panels by her other daughter, Kathleen, that were shown actually in the centennial. And then, of course, she's wielding her pen as a weapon. She tries to kind of shake the public up and let them know about all these important buildings that are being lost. So this is really before the preservation movement, but you might say that she's kind of proto-preservation as well as proto-feminist, making people think about this great loss. And finally, she and her generation sort of paved the way. You can see suffrage wins. The 19th Amendment passes in 1920. And although Greatorex was dead by that time, Eliza had passed away. Her daughter, Kathleen, lived until World War II. So I like to think that Kathleen actually cast her vote. So do please vote. So anyway, that concludes my talk. I thank you for your kind attention. And now we have time for questions. If you want to type your question in the chat or to post your questions on Facebook. Thank you.
Okay.
Kathy, thank you so much. That just like opens up so many issues in terms of women artists, women's contributions, the history of women in this country, and also the idea of travel and independence, both physical and economic. So let's take a look at the chat. Olivia, do you have any questions that have come in?
Not yet. I was was Greatorex herself a suffragette, like actively?
She wasn't really sort of, carrying placards or demonstrating the way Susan B. Anthony was. But the women's movement singled out some of these successful professional women and used them as models or examples. So that was part of the reason that they wanted to have them on the platform when they were speaking. And places, newspapers like the New York Times, they would show illustrations of these women like Susan B. Anthony on the stage lecturing, and then indicate the names of some of the women that were sitting behind her, and reinforcing this idea. It wasn't just because a lot of the women at the time, it wasn't just about the vote. It was also just being able to have access to professions and being able to make a living so that you could live independently of men. You have to keep in mind too that at the time, women didn't even have the right to have money in their name or property in their name. If a woman is married, say for example, when you're doing research and you look for women in the New York City directory, if they were married then, and their husband's still alive, only the husband's name was even listed. So it was still a time when women were in the shadows, and so somebody like Greatorex, who is kind of out there doing these things, served the purpose of the movement more as an example or a model for women than specifically as just like a protester or something.
Thank you. We have a few questions that just popped up in the chat. Francis was wondering, are there existing photos of Greatorex? And I think, did you show one in the PowerPoint? I'm not sure.
Oh, no, yes, there are a few photos, not very many. I didn't actually show them. I showed the two pictures of her daughters. Yeah, the two photographs that I showed of her daughters in their studio in Paris. But there are a few, and that portrait that I showed, the one by Boyle, is from comparison with the photographs, does show that he got a pretty good likeness.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Betsy made a comment and was wondering or had a question. She said, women like Mary Cassatt are so well known today, but Greatorex is new to many of us. How did the historical record get distorted in this way? And why was Greatorex somewhat forgotten?
Yeah, this is always a question we ponder, I think, a lot, and I have thought about it quite a bit. But I think one of the things that happens is that when people start writing the history of art from the point of view of modernism, they're looking back and they're sort of finding the characters who fit that narrative. Like Mary Cassatt worked with Degas, and that she looked at Japanese prints, and she was sort of a prototype for a precursor of some of the modernist ideas in and working with an artist in France and bringing these ideas back to America. Greatorex was a bit more traditional or conventional, you might say. And so I think people that didn't quite fit that story, you know, they got a little bit pushed to the side. That's one reason. And I think another reason is really some of the things I was pointing to in terms of, you know, these multimedia, you know. So some artists like Frederick Church, you know, he had a certain MO. He had certain things that he was known for, large scale paintings, certain types of subjects. But someone like Greatorex, who paints some Hudson River paintings, then she does the old New York, then she goes out west, then she goes to Morocco, you know, then she does etchings and is a pioneer in the etching revival. It's harder for people to kind of, I think, latch on to one identity. And so again, it's sometimes, I think people like that who are multi-talented and multifaceted sometimes also get a little bit pushed to the side at times. They don't have like a signature work or a signature style.
Mhm.
Thank you. Paul was saying that he came across info in contemporary newspapers that she suffered a serious illness that influenced her career, hence the very few oil paintings known. Do you have any information on this?
Well, she does have some illness, but it's never really identified. I was never able to identify what it was. But I think that was, from all my research, that was more towards the end of her career, because I mean, you know, she's climbing up mountains in Colorado, she's going down into the mines, she's doing some of these other things. So I think some of the health issues she had that I knew about were more in the last, more towards the end of her life, in the last decade of her life, when she wasn't as active. And her daughters then become more the torchbearers.
Mhm. Mhm.
And then Rosina was asking, do you think there's a connection between the defiance of artistic conventions and the lack of opportunity for commercial success? Women artists less concerned about making a living with their art and more focused on exploring and expressing themselves.
Well, I mean, certainly that's the case for some people, but I think in the case of Greatorex, I mean, you know, if you think about the economy of some of the artwork, you know, you do one oil painting, it can take sometimes it would take them months and months, and they would sell it for maybe a few $100s, $300 if they were lucky. Versus if you make these pen and ink drawings, you make reproductions of them. She was extremely enterprising in terms of, she would sell the books, she would sell the prints separately, and then she would also, she also made additional copies so that, say, like her friend Mary Louise Booth was writing a history of New York, she could include some of those images by Greatorex in her book, and so they would be reproduced by other people. So just one project like that would have a number of spin-offs, and so it would have the potential to actually make more money than perhaps just a single oil painting. I mean, some artists, like, you know, again, to cite the example of Church, you know, he could sell a blockbuster painting for, you know, thousands of dollars, but most people were not in that economy. They were selling things a few $100s here, a few $100s there. So really, in a way, she was diversifying. In her mind, it must have increased her chances of making money. But you know, it doesn't always work out that way, of course, as we know. But
Kathy, I have a question. If at any point she was supporting herself and her family through sales of her work, or did she have a dowry or an estate or an allowance to fall back on?
She really didn't. I mean, so many people just assume that about her. I've had people even be very dismissive of her, saying, oh, well, she was just, you know, like Mary Cassatt, came from a wealthy family, and or a relatively wealthy family, and you know, had a certain sort of stability because of that. Greatorex was, you know, came from Ireland. She came with very little. She came over in steerage. She married Henry. He died after 10 years. And even though people say, you know, I found letters that say Henry Greatorex was the most charming and brilliant, but he was so impractical. So we can only imagine, you know, he left her very little. So she was, you know, a lot of times she was just squeaking by, and sometimes her brother, thank goodness, and her sister would help her, but they were not wealthy either. So her brother did well in terms of business, but he, you know, he wasn't, you know, a Rockefeller or anything. So, you know, so, and we have various letters when she, even in 1877, before before she went off to Europe. She sells all her possessions in this big sale, and she writes to her friend how, you know, she's just brokenhearted that she had to sell all these things, because among the other things that she used to do is also be when she would go to the churches or things, sometimes she would find like antiques, and so she had this wonderful collection of antiques. She had to sell everything in order to just, then they get to Europe, and you know, they rent a, as they said, the dread furnished room, you know. So yeah, so she was scrappy. She was trying all kinds of different things, but they never had a really comfortable life.
So interesting. Olivia, I think we're getting some more questions.
Okay. Are any of the Greatorex family members alive today?
Well, her direct line, unfortunately, her two daughters never married. Her son died young. So none of them had any offsprings. Her brother had children, but I haven't been able to track down very many that had many artworks or materials that you know, from that. So it was kind of like her line. Her direct line was didn't really have offspring. Then her sister, you know, her sister's children did have some children, and I did manage to find a few of them, but most of them didn't have much in the way of material either. So I think because she moved around so much too. I mean, Eliza and her daughters moved around so many times that I think, you know, as we all know, when we move, we sort of throw away a lot of things that we can't necessarily take with us. And so it's just a frustration that some of this didn't survive. But we also know that, you know, some women, they kept diaries. They were very good letter writers. You know, Greatorex says, I hate writing letters. I don't have time for that. She was always busy, always on the move. So, you know, there may be some more materials out there, but you know, it's a lot of what I found was actually through the newspapers that people commented on what she was doing and you know, wrote about her activities.
That's great. Speaking of materials and artworks, Paul was wondering, do you know how many oils are known today?
She probably did about 100, I would say, you know, just from different titles. Sometimes you can't quite tell because sometimes, you know, they're just descriptive titles and they could change, but I think there must have been at least 100. Maybe now we know about 30. Only a few are actually in public collections. The rest of them are in private hands. And her daughters were actually prolific too. And so a lot of their works are around. But I'm hoping that maybe when the you know, when the book comes out and people start realizing who she, you know, recognizing maybe a name on a painting or something that they didn't recognize before, that maybe some more of this material will, you know, come to light, because that sometimes is what happens.
Okay. Yeah, it's true. So another question was, how did you come across Greatorex?
Well, it's kind of a crazy story, because when I first started out I was doing a sort of a cross study of the 1860s and 1870s, looking at this broad period and trying to argue that those two decades were very different from, you know, they called it the Gilded Age, but the Gilded Age is a very broad term and doesn't really apply to the whole late 19th century. So as I was researching, I kept coming up the name Mrs. Greatorex. Mrs. Greatorex did this. Finally, I said, oh my gosh, I have to just figure out who this Mrs. Greatorex was. And so then I started on her path, but that took me quite a while. So
yeah, and Laura was wondering, did the internet aid your research? Digitized newspaper and book records have made it so much more possible to recover these stories.
That's a really good point. Yeah, that's really what one of the big boons is that, you know, initially it was just, you know, do you find something in a library here, or find something, you know, you physically had to go to those places. But over time, yes, all the different digitized materials, and I hate to say it, but even places like, you know, the book dealers, sometimes a book of hers would pop up, you know, just, I mean, I hate to say it, I'm meaning that it was a commercial thing, that sometimes a book would pop up or a dealer would have something. So yes, but definitely the internet has been, I think, a big boon to a lot of research, and especially for the women. I mean, the one other thing to keep in mind is that, say if she had been named Eliza Smith, I probably would have been very much out of luck. But the fact that the name Greatorex was distinctive, that it wasn't as common, you can do searches and you can oftentimes find out a little bit more about them. So it's partly luck if you can find things, because when the women get married, their own family name often disappears. They're not going by that name anymore, and they get sort of subsumed into their husband's name. And so, that makes another challenge for researching these women.
I'm sure, yeah. So I think that's all we have for questions right now. I guess my question is, the book is available for pre-order currently, right? And I think I posted the link that you can find it in the chat. I'll also be posting that in the Facebook comments. And I guess my question for you is, what do we have to look forward to coming up for you? What are some things that you might be researching, or interesting topics that we should be looking out for?
Well, I think, of course, the women tend out to be endlessly fascinating. And one of the other topics that recently I've been in conversation with others about is Fidelia Bridgers. I mean, she was another really interesting character who, she comes from Salem, Massachusetts. Her father was a sea captain. And what's really interesting there is when he would travel, all the different captains and merchant people on the sea, when they came back to Salem, they would always collect these things and bring them to that was the foundation of the museum there. So her father is bringing back things from Asia and bringing all these different materials back. And then sadly he dies, and then her mother dies young. So she and her sisters forge ahead, but her art is very ethereal, very full of these references to Asian art. And so, she's another, so each one of these women is very distinctive. Paul mentioned Julia Hart Beers. Beers was the sister of two well-known male artists, James McDougall Hart and William Hart. And she tells stories about, oh, my brothers were going out sketching and I asked them if I could go too. And they would say, no, you can't keep up with us. And, she would go along and show that she could actually carry her own weight. So there are so many of these interesting stories out there. So part of my hope is not just that I want to work on them all, but I hope that other people take an interest in them, but also to incorporate them more into not just their own individual stories, but to incorporate them more into the, larger picture of American culture and American art, in survey books and things like that.
Yeah, surely. So I just want to say thank you so much, Kathy, for joining us today and for this talk. This is incredible. We do have some, we have our new exhibit, or I guess it's not so new at this point, but Women to the Fore, which incorporates kind of some of these topics, and then landscape art and virtual travel is also congruently going on at the HRM. We are open from Thursday to Sunday. We have 3 different time slots, so you can sign up on our website, www.hrm.org, for a slot to come visit the museum and see these exhibits and kind of relate some of what we talked about today to what you're seeing down there. And we're so excited that you have been here today with us. Sarah Linda, is there anything else you want to add?
The only thing, first of all, I wanted to thank Dr. Manthorne from the bottom of our hearts. Such a good friend to the museum, and this was such a perfect combination of all of what we're dealing with, we're thinking about, we're celebrating this fall. And actually, the Women to the Fore is on through January 3rd, I believe. And actually, landscape art and virtual travel will be on view from now through the beginning of August. And we have many, many different programs in store for you, having to do with both of these exhibitions. But I did want to mention that we will be here next week at 1:30 for a Curator from Home tour as we turn our sights toward the season of Halloween. And we will be talking about mourning, that's MOURNING in Glenview, and in general during the Victorian era with Laura Vuckles, our curator, and Victoria McKenna Ratchin, our assistant curator. So that's going to be next week starting at 1:30. And once again, thank you for this wonderful presentation. And thanks to the audience for your great questions and your attention and your comments. Have a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you, Olivia. And thank you, Laura, for your comments in the chat, and to our audience as well. This has really been a wonderful collaboration.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
everyone.
Any last words, Kathy?
I guess just to send the message to vote.
Okay. That's right. Coming down to the wire. Yes. Exercise your democratic rights.